Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Ashford called her? Not by name, never by name. Just a nurse, slowing down his rounds, asking unnecessary questions about patient files she had no business reading. Just a nurse with a limp and steady hands and eyes that had seen things. Ashford didn't know who was standing in his hospital. He had no idea what walked these corridors every night shift at Seattle General. And he had absolutely no idea that in 72 hours, 100 operators in full dress uniforms would be standing in the ER waiting room because of the choice he was about to make. The truth didn't just silence the room. It brought the hospital to its knees. The night shift began at 11:15 on a Tuesday. Natalie Hayes arrived early, the way she always did, parking her 10-year-old Toyota Camry in the same space near the loading dock where the shadows were deepest. She moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory older than her nursing license. Her left leg hitched slightly as she walked, compensation for damage that never quite healed, a souvenir from 3 years ago when an IED in Ramadi had decided her career as a major in the 75th Ranger Regiment was finished. The limp was barely noticeable now, just a whisper of asymmetry in her gait that most people mistook for fatigue or age. They were wrong about both. The hospital smelled like it always did at this hour, antiseptic and stale coffee and the faint copper undertone of blood beneath fluorescent lights that hummed their perpetual song. Natalie moved through the corridor toward the supply room, her scrubs an anonymous shade of blue that helped her disappear into the institutional landscape. 8 months she'd been here. 8 months of night shifts and paperwork and the careful performance of being unremarkable. The supply cart sat where she'd left it yesterday, waiting with empty 4 racks and restocked medication trays. Her hands moved through the inventory with the kind of precision that came from organizing combat field stations under worse conditions than a hospital supply closet. Saline bags aligned. Gauze packages squared. Trauma shears positioned within arm's reach. Everything in its place. Everything accessible. Everything ready. The night supervisor, Patricia, passed by with coffee cradled in both hands like a religious relic. She'd learned months ago that Natalie didn't need small talk. Some people earned quiet through conversation. Natalie earned it through competence. Patricia just nodded, and Natalie returned the gesture without looking up from the 4 lines she was organizing. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them both, indifferent to the invisible hierarchy that existed between the people who moved through these corridors. Patricia supervised nurses. Natalie was just a nurse. That's how the hierarchy worked. That's how everyone understood it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened when Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb arrived at 2:47 in the morning. The ambulance doors burst open in the trauma bay with the controlled chaos that came from organized emergency. Webb was rolled in on a stretcher, his left shoulder wrapped in soaked gauze, his right side splintered against internal injuries that made every breath a careful calculation. Shrapnel wounds from Ramadi. Multiple lacerations. Probable pneumothorax. Possible cardiac contusion. The kind of injury pattern that came from being too close to something that exploded. The paramedics' report was clipped and professional, 38-year-old male, IED in Jolin District, medevaced by Black Hawk, stable for transport but deteriorating in the last 6 minutes. The ER team moved with the precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times. And Natalie's clipboard clattered to the floor. Her hands didn't shake. Her face didn't crumble. But the clipboard hit tile with a sound like a gunshot, loud enough to echo off the linoleum, loud enough to make 3 nurses glance over. She stared at Webb's face for exactly 2 seconds. The recognition was instantaneous. She'd seen him once before, at David's unit graduation ceremony 6 years ago. He'd given a speech about leadership and sacrifice. He'd shaken her son's hand. And now he was here, bleeding through gauze, and her son was deployed in Syria, and this man was the one who'd put him in harm's way. She bent down to retrieve the clipboard before anyone could ask questions. The motion was smooth. The recovery was complete. The moment passed. Dr. Ashford noticed everything. He noticed the way her hands had stilled for a fraction of a second. He noticed the way her eyes had locked on the patient's face. He noticed that she knew this man somehow, and it interested him in the way that small anomalies interested clinical minds, as puzzles to be solved later, details to be filed away. Ashford was competent in a way that made him dangerous. He didn't shout or bully randomly. He was a planner. A strategist. A man who understood that information was power and that power was money and that money was the only thing that actually mattered. He stood at the nurse's station as they prepped Webb for imaging, watching Natalie move through her work with the same quiet efficiency she brought to every task. She was different with this patient. Careful. Attentive. The kind of attention that suggested a connection. Ashford filed it away. 20 minutes later, Natalie was helping transfer Webb to the CT scanner when Ashford called her over to the nurse's station. His office sat adjacent to the main desk, door perpetually open, computer screen visible to anyone who happened to walk past at the wrong moment. He was reviewing something on his monitor, a file, flagged with some kind of authorization restriction. The kind of file that regular staff members shouldn't have access to. The kind of file that made Natalie's stomach tighten the moment she saw it. He didn't close the window when she approached. Maybe he didn't notice her line of sight. Maybe he did. With Ashford, intention was always ambiguous. On the screen, in text small enough to require proximity to read but large enough to be visible, were patient histories. Not standard medical records. These were different. Trial documentation. Pharmaceutical records. Experimental drug protocols with names like Cascade 7 and Nextel Prime and annotations that included phrases like pre-authorization consent waived and the adverse event monitoring discontinued. Webb's name appeared twice. Other names appeared below his. Soldiers' names. Veterans. People who'd been through programs that had checkmarks next to informed consent that read not applicable. Natalie's hands moved on their own. Her left hand reached out to steady herself against the desk. And as she did, her jacket shifted just enough for the collar to gape slightly, revealing something beneath the scrubs. Something small and faded and stitched into the interior lining where no one was supposed to see it. A patch. Unit insignia. 75th Ranger Regiment. Wear faded from desert sun and sweat and 6 years of classified operations. A secret that had stayed buried since the day she'd been medically discharged with a shattered left leg and a decision to disappear into a life where no one asked questions and no one looked too closely at the careful way she moved through the world. Ashford's eyes flickered down to it for just a moment. His brain processed the image without context. A patch. Nothing. He turned back to his computer and closed the file. "Get me the latest vitals on our Ramadi patient," he said. Not a request. A command delivered with the casual authority of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "I want to monitor his progress personally." "Of course, Doctor," Natalie said. Her voice was steady. Deferential. The voice of someone who understood her place in a hierarchy that was absolutely clear. Her hand dropped from the patch, tucking it back beneath the scrubs, sliding it back into the darkness where it belonged. But her heart moved like it was trying to break through her ribs. She'd been found. No. Not found. Seen. Someone had glimpsed something, and now the secret that had kept her safe for 3 years, the quiet obscurity of being just a nurse, was already beginning to unravel. The night shift continued. Webb stabilized in the ICU. His imaging came back showing what everyone expected: trauma, trauma, and more trauma. Survivable trauma, if he received proper care. Treatable trauma. The kind that didn't kill people with good doctors and steady nurses and institutional support. Natalie moved through her work with the same methodical precision she'd brought to every shift. 4 lines. Medication administration. Vitals monitoring. Everything correct. Everything by protocol. But now she knew something she shouldn't know. About Webb. About the trials. about whatever Ashford was doing with the veteran population that fell through the cracks of the VA system and into private hospital care where restrictions didn't apply and consent forms could be filed away in locked cabinets where no one asked questions. And worse than that, Ashford had seen the patch. Just for a moment. Just for long enough that his clinical mind would file it away and wonder about it later. She was still just a nurse. But the clock had started running on that assumption, and in 72 hours, very specific people were going to receive very specific phone calls telling them that Major Natalie Hayes had just been found. What she didn't know yet was that those 3 hours were going to be the longest and bloodiest of her entire life. 3 days after Lieutenant Colonel Webb's admission, the overhead page crackled through Seattle General's ICU at 6:11 a.m. Grandma Nightingale to the nurse's station. Grandma Nightingale, your walker is ready. The voice was Dr. Ashford's, thin with satisfaction. Laughter rippled across the floor, a few nurses covering their mouths, others pretending not to hear, all of them suddenly very interested in their charts. Natalie kept moving, her limp barely perceptible, her face the blank slate she perfected over 23 years of keeping her composure when the world decided to break something. She didn't pause. Didn't flush. Didn't acknowledge that she was the target. She simply walked past the cluster of morning shift staff, past the medication carts, past the ventilators that wheezed their mechanical rhythm, and continued checking vitals on her assigned patients as if the page had been directed at someone else entirely. But it wasn't. It was a message. He'd seen her glimpse those files on his computer screen, the experimental trials, the forged consent forms, the pharmaceutical company payment records, and now he was drawing a line. Now he was showing her that he owned this hospital in ways that mattered. The supply closet came 2 days later. Natalie was restocking 18-gauge for catheters when the door opened behind her and Ashford stepped inside, close enough that the hinges swung shut and the fluorescent light above them flickered once like a nervous eye. He didn't bother with pleasantries. His voice came out level, controlled, the kind of calm that comes from knowing you have institutional power as your backup. You're overstepping your authority. Asking questions about patient medications during rounds. Discussing protocol deviations with other staff members. I could file a HIPAA violation right now, confidentiality breach, unauthorized access to medical records, and your license gets flagged for investigation. He stepped closer. Her back was against the metal shelves, boxes of gauze pressing into her spine. I could call the state board. I could have you written up. I could make sure that by the time this hospital's legal team finishes with you, you'll be lucky to work in a walk-in clinic in rural Nevada. His hands were at his sides, but his presence was a physical thing, the air pressure changing, his cologne sharp as antiseptic. Do you understand me, Natalie? She took one measured breath. Her hands, which had held bleeding soldiers in a kill zone outside Ramadi, remained perfectly steady. When she spoke, her voice came out like stone, each word deliberate, heavy, impossible to misinterpret. I understand that someone needs to ask questions. The silence in that supply closet lasted exactly 3 seconds. His jaw tightened. His eyes went flat. Then he opened the door and left without another word, and Natalie went back to counting gauze pads with hands that didn't shake. The reassignment came the next shift. Pediatric wing. The message was clear: you're being removed from proximity to Lieutenant Colonel Webb. You're being isolated. You're being punished for what you know. Natalie worked with the children, a 6-year-old with acute leukemia, an 8-year-old recovering from appendectomy, a 3-year-old whose mother hadn't left her bedside in 72 hours. The work was good. The children didn't judge her. But everyone knew what a pediatric reassignment meant coming from the ICU. It meant loss of status. It meant Ashford had decided you were a liability. The parking lot came on Thursday evening, 5:52 p.m., during shift change when the entire evening staff was clustering near their cars, unwinding, laughing, ready to escape. Ashford walked directly toward her, a man in his mid-50s with the kind of tailored suit that cost more than her monthly rent, his voice carrying across the asphalt like he'd amplified it through a megaphone. 30 staff members turned. Natalie's colleagues. The people she'd trained. The nurses she'd covered when their kids got sick or their marriages fell apart. He announced her relief of lead nurse duties due to concerning judgment lapses. He spoke about inability to follow protocol. He used the word unstable once, then repeated it. Natalie Hayes will be transitioning to general floor work under supervisory review effective immediately. We need to ensure her clinical judgment is being appropriately monitored. The evening sun was turning the parking lot the color of rust. A single tear traced down her cheek, not from pain, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of knowing exactly what was happening and being powerless to stop it. Her colleagues looked away. One of them stared at her shoe. Another unlocked her car door with theatrical necessity, suddenly desperate to escape the scene. Natalie wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact. Her hand was steady. Her voice was steady. When she spoke, it came out in a register so low that only Ashford heard it, though everyone watched her lips move. My husband died so men like you could sleep safely at night. Died in a combat zone 5,000 miles away so you could feel secure, so you could perform your little power plays in parking lots in front of people who respect my name more than they respect your title. I can handle your cruelty. I handled worse at 23 years old, bleeding out in Ramadi with shrapnel in my spine and 19 operators depending on me to keep them alive. She paused. So go ahead. Reassign me. Threaten my license. Do whatever you need to do to feel like you matter. I've already survived the worst. Her hand unconsciously touched the jacket lining where the faded Special Forces unit patch lay hidden, a reflex, something she hadn't meant to reveal, but there it was. The moment her fingers found the worn fabric, something shifted in Ashford's expression. Not understanding exactly, but recognition that he'd misjudged something fundamental about the woman standing in front of him. By then it was too late. That night, Natalie's apartment was too quiet. Her medically discharged leg ached from the double shifts and the increased floor work. She'd spent 3 years building a civilian life, steady employment, quiet routine, no mentions of the Bronze Star or the Purple Heart or the combat medical badge that she'd earned pulling bleeding men from a collapsed building while artillery rounds shook the earth. Now her past and present had collided violently, and the man at the center of the collision was her son's commanding officer. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb had served under her command structure in Ramadi. She'd trained him. She'd watched him develop from a young officer into a tactical leader. And somewhere in this hospital, someone was trying to silence him with experimental drugs and forged consent forms, and Ashford was orchestrating it all with the precision of a surgeon. She spread her documentation across the kitchen table, shift schedules altered through the system, medication orders that didn't match the approved protocol, the names of 2 pharmaceutical company representatives who visited Ashford's office on consecutive Tuesdays at exactly 3 p.m. The pattern was obvious once you saw it. The question was what to do with it. Her phone buzzed at 9:17 p.m. David. Her son. His voice came through tight, controlled, the way he sounded when he was delivering bad news to subordinates. Mom, Colonel Webb told me to tell you to be careful. He said someone's been changing his medication schedule, the pain medication dosages, and that you're the only nurse who questioned the orders. She closed her eyes. He knows. He knows something's wrong. He doesn't know everything. But he knows you tried to help, and he wanted you to know that if something happens to you, the whole unit will know why. The line crackled slightly. Where are you right now? Home. Safe. Thinking. Keep thinking, but be careful how you move. Whatever this is, it's bigger than a single doctor. Ashford has connections. He has lawyers on speed dial. Webb saw something in Ramadi that people want kept quiet, and now you've seen it too. That makes you a problem. After they hung up, Natalie sat in the darkness of her living room with the documentation spread before her like a map of Ashford's crimes. Tomorrow he would escalate. She could feel it approaching like distant thunder. The supply closet had been pressure. The parking lot had been humiliation. What came next would be strategic, calculated moves to isolate her completely, to ensure she had no access to Webb, no authority within the hospital, no credibility if she tried to speak up. Ashford was done playing. Now he was going to destroy her systematically, methodically, with the precision of a man who'd done it before. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he still had no idea who he was trying to destroy. The maintenance request had been filed at 4:56 p.m. on Thursday, innocuous and professional. Ashford's signature was there, authorizing electrical upgrades to the ICU wing. The hospital's facilities manager didn't question it. Dr. Ashford held enough institutional weight that his requests moved through the approval process like water through a sieve. By 8:15 p.m., the security camera feeds to the entire third-floor ICU corridor had been severed. Not disabled. Not malfunctioning. CAT. The electrical crew Ashford had hired through a shell contractor worked silently, their movements precise and purposeful, the kind of efficiency that comes from having done this before. They were gone by 9 p.m., leaving only a fabricated work order and a hospital wing with blind spots where oversight used to exist. At 9:13 p.m., Ashford filed an emergency drill notice. Pediatric wing. Potential contamination event. All available nursing staff to report immediately for decontamination protocols. It was a lie wrapped in the language of hospital safety, and it worked. The floor staff scattered like startled birds, leaving Webb's corridor staffed by a single exhausted nurse named Chen stationed at the far end of the wing, responsible for 4 rooms, her attention divided and thinning. Ashford had calculated this down to the minute. He'd studied the schedules, the staffing patterns, the vulnerabilities in Seattle General's infrastructure the way a chess player studies a board. What he hadn't calculated was Natalie. She shouldn't have been working Thursday night. Her shift was Wednesday through Saturday 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., but the pediatric drill had created chaos in the scheduling system, and her badge, the one that should have been flagged after the parking lot incident, still worked because the security guard at the loading dock was a former Marine named Holloway who'd seen what Ashford had done to her and who'd quietly restored her access that afternoon without filing the proper paperwork. Holloway's daughter had suffered a hemolytic crisis 2 years earlier, and Natalie had spent 16 hours at that bedside, holding the girl's hand through transfusions, explaining in calm, clear language what her body was doing and why it would stop doing it soon, and the girl had lived, and Holloway had never forgotten. So when Natalie approached the dock at 10:24 p.m. in civilian clothes with a determination in her posture that reminded him of drill instructors he'd known in Camp Lejeune, he waved her through without a word. She moved through the corridors like someone who belonged there, her limp barely visible under the careful distribution of her weight. The third floor was too quiet. Natalie had worked night shifts long enough to know what silence meant in a hospital. It meant absence, and absence meant someone had planned it. She'd seen the maintenance crew loading equipment into their van from the parking lot window during her evening walk. She'd watched the drill notice propagate through the staff group chat. She knew Ashford. Not intimately, but with the clarity that comes from being hunted. Webb's room was at the end of the corridor. The monitors were beeping their steady rhythm, heart rate 88, blood pressure 142/86, oxygen saturation 97% on a nasal cannula delivering 2 liters. Normal. Stable. A man recovering from shrapnel wounds who should have been sleeping under the influence of the pain medication Natalie had watched the night shift nurse administer at 9:15 p.m. She was reviewing his chart at the bedside station when the elevator doors hissed open at 11:23 p.m. 2 men in civilian clothes walked toward Webb's room with the casual confidence of people who'd done this before. No hospital badges. No ID lanyards. No hesitation. One wore a dark blue jacket over a charcoal shirt. The other had a windbreaker zipped to his chin despite the climate-controlled warmth of the ICU. Their hands moved with the unconscious precision of men trained to use them, fingers slightly curved, weight distributed low in their hips, ready. Natalie's combat instincts recognized them before her conscious mind did, the same way a predator's nervous system registers danger 3 seconds before the threat appears in conscious vision. She stepped out from behind the bedside station and positioned herself between the 2 men and Webb's bed. "Those aren't authorized syringes," she said quietly. Her voice didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. The tremor she felt was something else entirely, not fear, but the ancient recognition that came from 3 tours of combat medicine, from holding pressure on wounds while mortar fire painted the air orange, from knowing exactly what violence looked like when it wore a human face. The man on the left reached toward his jacket. Webb, still groggy but conscious enough to understand his own danger, reached for his phone on the bedside table. "You need to leave," the second man said to Natalie. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact delivered with the tone of someone accustomed to compliance. "I'm not moving," Natalie said. The fluorescent lights hummed their sterile song above them. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Outside the window, Jacksonville rain hammered the glass like applause from an audience Natalie couldn't see. The first man's hand came out of his jacket holding a syringe with a long needle, the kind used for intravenous injection. There was nothing medical about his movement. There was nothing clinical about the way he stepped forward. Natalie's hands moved on their own, memory and training taking over. She pivoted, her weight shifting to her right leg despite the phantom ache in her left where shrapnel had traveled through bone and muscle years ago in a place called Ramadi. Her left arm came up defensively. The needle punched through fabric and into her shoulder, that initial moment of resistance as the blade penetrated skin and then the sudden give as it entered muscle. The sensation was old and familiar, pain was information, and information was survival. She didn't cry out. She didn't flinch. Her elbow drove backward at the second man's face as he moved to compensate. The needle tore free from her shoulder as she twisted, blood already spreading across the pale fabric of her scrubs. "Get security," she said to Webb, her voice steady as a surgical laser. The heart monitor's rhythm accelerated, Webb's stress response visible in real time on the screen. The second man lunged as Natalie still refused to move from between them and the patient. She felt the blade enter her side just below her ribs, the sensation like ice and fire braided together. Her training compartmentalized the pain, stored it, filed it away, dealt with it later. Right now there was only the tactical problem of protecting Webb and triggering an alarm that would bring help before these men could finish what Ashford had contracted them to do. Her elbow came down hard on the red call button. Then again. Blood was spreading now, soaking through the front and side of her scrubs, but her body remained upright, still shielding the patient, her hands gripping the bed frame for balance as her nervous system started to register the severity of what was happening. Webb was already on his feet despite the pain medication and trauma, his military training overriding everything else. Boots on tile. Running. Shouting for security. The two men looked at each other and moved toward the door, their mission compromised by Natalie's refusal to move, by the fact that the patient was no longer isolated and undefended. Chen appeared from the far end of the corridor, phone in hand, her voice high and sharp as she called in the emergency. "Code emergency, ICU 3rd floor, 2 assailants, officer stabbed." That wasn't the right terminology, but it was close enough and urgent enough to matter. Natalie slid down the bed frame, her back against the mattress, her hand pressed to her side where blood continued to pour between her fingers. The fluorescent lights flickered. The heart monitor's rhythm climbed, 95 beats per minute, 104, 112. Webb was calling her name. Security was still 30 seconds away. The elevator was rising. And through the fog of blood loss and adrenaline, Natalie understood what Ashford had tried to do and what it meant that she was still breathing. Security was already running when the first blade punched through Natalie's left shoulder. The sound was wrong, not like the movies, but wet and final, the kind of sound that changes everything. She didn't scream. She didn't fall back. Her body simply accepted the wound the way a soldier accepts fire and keeps moving forward. The man with the knife had expected her to stumble. Instead, she shifted her weight, angling her torso to keep herself between Webb and the second assailant. Webb was reaching for the call button, but his movements were sluggish with sedation, his reflexes those of a man still halfway between consciousness and dreams. Natalie's were not. Pain was information. The blade had gone deep, she could feel it grinding against bone, feel the heat of blood running down her ribs beneath her scrubs. She pressed harder against the mattress, using her legs to brace, turning herself into a human shield the way she'd done 37 times in Ramadi when the IED blast hadn't killed her, it had just taught her how to bleed and keep breathing. The second knife came faster. She saw the trajectory, recognized the angle, understood in the mathematical language of combat that she had 1.2 seconds to move or accept the wound. She didn't move. The blade tore through her right side, just below the floating rib cage, and the pain was so bright and immediate that her vision whited out for a fraction of a second. Her left hand was already moving, muscle memory taking over like an autonomous system, her elbow reaching down toward the emergency alert pad mounted on Webb's bed frame. Her fingers wouldn't reach. The wound had compromised too much. But her elbow could. Her elbow was still working. She drove her elbow down against the red button and felt it depress with a soft electronic chirp that meant nothing here but meant everything, meant that somewhere in this hospital, an alert was pinging at a nurse's station, meant that code blue was about to become code red, meant that she had maybe 90 seconds before someone arrived. The second assailant grabbed her arm, twisting it, and she felt something tear in her shoulder, the rotator cuff. She recognized the sensation from a training injury years ago, back when she'd been learning how to brake in ways that didn't break her. She twisted with the leverage instead of against it, felt his grip weaken as her body weight came down on his wrist at an angle he hadn't expected. He let go. Both men were moving toward the door now, hearing the accelerating footsteps in the hallway. Natalie collapsed against Webb's bed frame, her breath coming in short, controlled gasps. Not hyperventilation. Not panic. The breathing of someone who understood that shock could kill her faster than blood loss if she let it. Security arrived in 47 seconds. 2 officers in dark uniforms, radios crackling, their hands going immediately to restraint procedures before they understood there was nothing left to restrain. The assailants were already gone, disappearing into the service stairwell as if they'd never been more than shadows. Security was calling for trauma, calling for blood bank, calling for Dr. Ashford as the senior attending on the night shift. Natalie's vision was narrowing now, the edges going soft and grey. She was aware of hands on her, aware of scissors cutting away her scrubs, aware of the attending physician, not Ashford, someone else, someone with steady hands who recognized a stab wound when he saw one, checking the depth and angle of the blade entry. 2 wounds, the attending said. Left shoulder, right flank. We need level 1 trauma activation. Natalie tried to speak, but her voice came out thin. Webb? The patient stable. You protected him. Just hold still. The attending was already moving, already calling orders, 2 units of O negative, trauma bay 2, get her on the gurney now, pressure dressings, we need a surgeon in 5 minutes. The wound care was efficient and practiced, the kind of trauma response that meant Seattle General saw enough knife wounds that the staff moved like a choreographed dance they'd performed 1,000 times before. Someone was cutting and fall line, someone else was checking her pupils with a pen light, someone was peeling away her blood-soaked scrubs and revealing the network of scars underneath, old service scars, combat scars, scars that nobody in this hospital had known existed because Natalie had spent 8 months being just a nurse, just another tired woman in scrubs pushing medications and checking vital signs and keeping her history buried. The scars were visible for exactly 47 seconds before they were covered with trauma blankets. That was when Ashford arrived. He moved through the trauma bay with the confidence of a man who owned it, his eyes taking in the scene, the blood on the floor, the fall lines, Webb's white-knuckled grip on his bed rail, and finally, Natalie's face. His expression shifted through calculation so quickly that only someone trained in reading human behavior would have caught it. He saw the scars. He saw the military-grade composure. He saw the problem she'd just become, and he moved to solve it. What happened? His voice was pleasant, concerned, the tone of a senior physician gathering facts. 2 assailants, Dr. Ashford, the trauma attending said, not looking up from the ultrasound she was running. Possible robbery attempt. They fled when security arrived. Patient was stabbed twice protecting Lieutenant Colonel Webb. Ashford nodded slowly. He was already pulling out his phone, already making a calculation. Natalie watched him from her position on the gurney, her breathing steady even as the first responders were moving her toward the trauma bay. She couldn't see anything clearly anymore, the light was too bright, her body was too full of endorphins and adrenaline and the strange clarity that comes with severe blood loss. But she could read people. She could read the way Ashford's shoulders relaxed, the way his concern shifted into something that looked like satisfaction. "We need to get her to surgery," the attending said. "Possible hepatic involvement depending on the angle of entry. She needs to be upstairs in 3 minutes or we risk catastrophic hemorrhage." They wheeled her toward the elevator, the fluorescent lights blurring overhead like a tunnel of white noise. Ashford followed at a distance, his phone already in motion, already making calls. She could hear fragments, contaminated the crime scene with her irrational behavior. And clearly having a psychiatric episode. And need to document her instability before she starts making accusations. The elevator doors closed. The trauma team was moving with controlled urgency, not panic, never panic, but the focused intensity of people who understood they had a patient whose insides were trying to become outsides. Natalie closed her eyes and counted her breaths. In for 4. Out for 4. The way they'd taught her at Walter Reed. The way she'd taught herself to survive. 2 days later, she stood at her late husband's grave in the rain. The headstone was simple grey marble, worn smooth by 3 years of weather and the hands of a woman who visited every Wednesday. Lieutenant James Hayes. 1985 to 2019. Beloved husband. Beloved father. Loving service to country. The words were inadequate, the way words always were when trying to contain a life. Natalie pressed her palm flat against the cold stone, her hand trembling not from emotion but from the physical reality of massive blood loss and surgical trauma. She'd been discharged 36 hours after admission with 16 stitches in her shoulder and 23 stitches in her side, antibiotics in a paper bag, and discharge papers that included a psychiatric evaluation form. The rain was cold. It felt like punishment, like cleansing, like the sky itself was trying to wash something away that soap and time couldn't reach. She pressed her forehead against the headstone and whispered words that the rain would carry away. "I found David's commanding officer and I couldn't protect him. I failed you. I failed our son. I failed everyone who trusted me." The words weren't true, Webb was alive, the attackers were gone, she'd done exactly what she was trained to do. But the truth and the feeling were different animals, and right now the feeling was a weight that made even breathing difficult. She'd survived the blast that killed James. She'd survived infection and amputation fears and learning to walk again. She'd survived becoming a nurse because it was the only way she knew how to keep helping people without holding a gun. And now, in a single night, she'd lost her job, her reputation, her last connection to a normal life. Ashford had one. Or so it seemed at 2:02 p.m. on a rain-soaked Wednesday in Jacksonville. 3 hours earlier, in a back office at Seattle General, a routine background check had pinged a system flagged long ago by a different government agency. Her medical credentials, her employment history, her current address, all of it had triggered an automated alert that read, "Classified security clearance on file, federal verification required before badge deactivation." The request had been submitted to a server, which had routed it to a database, which had confirmed that Major Natalie Hayes, Medical Corps, United States Army Special Forces Command, still maintained an active TS-SCI clearance and was currently flagged for emergency contact protocols. The phone call to her was never made. The emergency contact notification went somewhere else entirely, to the headquarters of a unit that didn't exist on any public record, located in a facility that the federal government would politely deny knowing anything about. And within 180 minutes of that call being placed, people who had spent the last 3 years quietly tracking a major they'd assumed was dead began moving. They began making calls. They began reminding people that there were debts owed, favors unpaid, and that if someone had just stabbed one of their own, well, there were ways of handling that didn't go through civilian law enforcement. The rain continued to fall. Natalie continued to stand at her husband's grave, not knowing yet that 60 miles away, soldiers were loading gear into vehicles, that helicopter crews were being scrambled, that 100 men in dress uniforms were being briefed on a mission that wasn't a mission but an obligation, a debt repaid to a major who'd never asked for it but had earned it in the bloodiest currency any human could. The rain had stopped. The city exhaled. And 100 men in dress uniforms began moving through Jacksonville like a storm system nobody had predicted. They materialized at Seattle General's front in trance exactly 3 hours after Natalie collapsed. Not a warning. Not a request for permission. 100 Special Forces operators, 75th Ranger Regiment colors on their sleeves, filed through the glass doors with the synchronized precision of men who'd trained for every contingency except the one happening now. Their boots struck the tile in unison, a sound like distant thunder rolling across a field. The lead operator was David, her son. His jaw was set the way it got before combat insertions, when the weight of command settled across his shoulders like body armor. He approached the front desk where the administrator stood frozen, a stack of personnel files trembling in her hands. David snapped a salute so sharp it echoed off the polished floor. "Major Hayes," he said, his voice steady as a helicopter holding altitude. "Your unit is here." The administrator's pen clattered against the desk. Behind David, the operators spread through the hospital corridors like water finding cracks. No uniforms from a recruiting office or a dress ceremony. These were combat veterans in dress blues, the kind worn for funerals and ceremonies where somebody needed to witness that the cost had been real. They moved with the terrifying fluid grace of men who'd spent years moving through buildings where hesitation meant death. Every hallway they passed through, every nurse and orderly they nodded to, the question became the same: who exactly was Major Natalie Hayes? The administrator's hand shook as she opened the personnel file. Hospital records. Termination paperwork. But underneath, files that had been sealed, classified, waiting for exactly this moment. Her voice cracked as she read aloud. Bronze Star. Silence. She looked up. The operators stood motionless. Purple Heart. Her finger traced the dates. Combat Medical Badge. She turned the page. Medical Discharge. Full Honors. Reason: shrapnel to the left lower extremity and lumbar spine. Theater: Ramadi, Iraq. Date of injury: 3 years ago. She swallowed hard. There's a second Purple Heart. Anna, she stopped. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Naval Commendation Medal. A barrel-chested SEAL team leader stepped forward. His name tape read Holloway. His beard was trimmed regulation tight, and his eyes were the color of winter storm clouds, the kind that come before everything changes. He'd been waiting for this moment for 3 years. Since Ramadi. Since the moment a combat medic with steady hands and impossible courage had pulled his bleeding body out of a fire zone and held pressure on a wound while bullets decorated the dirt around them both. Holloway's voice carried through the corridor like a command that transcended rank. Major Natalie Hayes personally saved 19 operators under enemy fire in Ramadi. He paused, and the hospital seemed to hold its breath. She took shrapnel to the spine, pulling my bleeding body out of a kill zone. While my squad was returning fire, while everything was chaos and noise, she ran into the open and she did not flinch. Not once. He looked directly at the administrator. That woman just took 2 stab wounds protecting one of my commanding officers. So let me be clear about something: you made a mistake. Before security could even move toward Dr. Ashford, who was standing frozen near the patient records desk, FBI agents appeared with the methodical precision of men executing a warrant they'd been waiting hours to serve. They held a phone, Lieutenant Colonel Webb's phone. The audio was crystal clear. Ashford's voice, unmistakable: "They go in at 11 p.m. Full syringe. Make it look like a reaction. I don't care if he codes. That's the whole point." Then a second voice, filtered and professional, understood. "And the nurse?" "Ashford, gone. She's already terminated. Nobody will question it." The agents played it again. And again. 4 million people would hear it that evening on the 6 o'clock news. By 6 p.m., Dr. Ashford sat in a television studio under fluorescent lights that made his skin look like old paper. The anchor beside him was sympathetic, concerned, the kind of journalist who believed the last person who spoke with conviction. He'd prepared for this. He'd practiced in his mind 100 times. Disgruntled employee. Mental instability. Conspiracy theory. The narrative was clean. Manageable. I'm here to talk about Major Natalie Hayes, he began, the word major coming out like a punchline he'd meant to mock. A disgruntled employee who attacked two pharmaceutical representatives and has been spreading dangerous conspiracy theories about veteran care. His voice carried the rehearsed concern of a man who'd lied to hospital boards for 6 years. She has a history of mental instability. She was dishonorably discharged for exactly this kind of behavior. The studio phone rang. The anchor's earpiece crackled. Her expression shifted from sympathy to something else entirely. We have a caller. General Marcus Thornton. General, you're on the air. The voice that followed was ice and steel and precision. A 4-star general's voice, the kind that stopped wars and ended careers. Dr. Ashford just committed slander on national television. Major Natalie Hayes was medically retired with full honors. Her DD 214 sits in front of me right now. I also have FBI evidence of experimental drug trials conducted on 17 veterans without proper consent. Falsified consent forms. Payments from PharmaCorp totaling $340,000 to your personal accounts. Ashford's face went white. Lieutenant Colonel Webb recorded your conversation ordering tonight's attack, the general continued, methodical and devastating. We have bank records. We have testimony from the 2 men you hired. We have documentation of 6 hospitals, Dr. Ashford. 6. And every veteran organization in this country is now watching you lie about a decorated combat medic who took 2 knife wounds tonight protecting one of my officers. A medic who pulled your hired operatives apart with her bare hands while bleeding out. A medic who kept Lieutenant Colonel Webb alive with nothing but pressure and training and the kind of composure you will never understand. Ashford stood. His microphone ripped away. But the cameras followed him anyway, broadcasting his retreat live to 4 million viewers across Jacksonville and the military communities beyond it. 6 months later, Natalie walked past a strip mall on Atlantic Boulevard, her limp barely noticeable anymore after physical therapy had worn down the sharp edges of the scar tissue. The afternoon sun was brutal and clean. She wore her dress blues under her Chief of Trauma Services coat, old habit, or maybe something deeper. Something that refused to forget who she was under the title. Dr. Ashford sat at a folding table beneath a faded insurance company banner, his medical license revoked, his pharmaceutical partners under federal indictment, his empire reduced to cold calling strangers about coverage plans. His eyes tracked her as she passed. Recognition flickered across his face. His mouth opened as if to speak. She didn't stop. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't slow her stride. The past was behind her now, and Ashford was just a man at a folding table, a cautionary tale nobody would remember in 5 years. Her office at Jacksonville VA Hospital displayed the faded unit patch in a professional frame, positioned beside a photograph of David pinning on her restored rank at a ceremony attended by the 100 operators who'd stood for her. The photograph was dated from the day Ashford's trial concluded. Lieutenant Colonel Webb had recovered fully. His testimony had been methodical and devastating. The 2 men who tried to kill him were serving federal sentences. And every night, Natalie moved through the VA trauma wing with steady hands and careful eyes, seeing what others missed, the tremor in a veteran's hands that meant PTSD, the way a certain sound made somebody freeze, the weight of carrying things nobody else could carry. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself thinking about the people who serve quietly in the background, subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Comment with your thoughts. What would you have done in Natalie's position? Would you have kept walking past that table, or would the weight of what happened have pulled you backward? Tell us in the comments. We'll be back with another story tomorrow.